everyone, I'm Ness. Welcome to my weekly Human Rights Talk. If you've been following my videos this summer, you might remember that a few weeks ago I talked a little bit about what the ADA says about getting accommodations at work and about discrimination at work, which is included in Title I of the ADA. This week, in honor of the ADA's birthday, I'm going to talk a little bit about Title II of the ADA. Next week, I'll talk about Title III of the ADA. Just like Title I of the ADA makes it illegal to discriminate on the basis of disability in employment situations, Title II of the ADA makes it illegal to discriminate against disabled folks in public entities. A public entity is any place, organization, or program that is run by a state or local government that provides services to the public. That includes places like City Hall, city and state parks, public schools, courthouses, libraries, services like emergency services, and programs run by state and local governments, like if your city parks and rec department has programs like summer camps, or if your local library has educational programs, things like that. Title II of the ADA also makes it illegal to discriminate in public transportation, like buses and trains. This isn't a full list of things that count as public entities, just a few examples of some public entities to help explain what I mean. When it talks about discrimination in public entities, the ADA talks about how physical spaces have to be accessible, how policies must not be discriminatory, and how procedures and practices must also not be discriminatory. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about how physical spaces have to be accessible and what that looks like in practice, because I plan to talk a lot about that in next week's video. I do want to talk about a point of confusion that people often have about building accessibility in the ADA. Sometimes you might hear people say that buildings built before 1991 don't have to meet the accessibility standards in the ADA, or that only new construction has to meet the accessibility standards of the ADA. That is only partially true. All new construction has to meet the accessibility standards in the ADA. And for updates or renovations to older buildings, the part being updated or renovated has to meet the accessibility standards in the ADA. However, one thing that some people don't know is that public entities are also required to remove barriers to accessibility in older buildings as long as doing so wouldn't present an undue burden. When considering whether or not fixing an accessibility problem would present too much of a financial burden, the wealth and income of the entity is considered. An entity with not a lot of money might not have to make the same updates as one that did have a lot of money. So when it comes to public entities, even those that are run out of older or inaccessible buildings still have to make their programs and services accessible. An example of this would be if you want to meet with your state legislator, but you use a wheelchair and their office is on the second floor of an old building that does not have an elevator. The legislator could meet with you in a first floor office instead. This would be okay and not in violation of the ADA as long as the accessible space they meet with you in offered the same level of privacy as their office would have. So it would be okay for them to meet with you in an accessible office on the first floor, but not in the first floor lobby or cafeteria because those spaces offer a lot less privacy than an office. Under the ADA, public entities are required to also make sure their policies, procedures, and practices are not discriminatory. Policies are the official written down rules about accessing a service and about how the service is run. Procedures and practices cover all the ways the public service or entity is actually run, like the way the people who work for the public entity treat you, whether or not it's actually part of their rules. A policy is considered discriminatory under the ADA if it is explicitly discriminatory or if it has a discriminatory effect, whether or not that is intentional. An example of an explicitly discriminatory policy would be if a public school did not allow students in their special education classes to go on field trips. An example of a policy that has a discriminatory effect would be if a public entity required driver's licenses as proof of identity or age. Since some people with some disabilities may not be able to obtain a driver's license, this policy would have the effect of excluding those people, which is discriminatory. This entity would have to accept other forms of identification in order to not violate the ADA. A policy may not be considered discriminatory even if it excludes disabled people if the entity can prove that a less exclusionary policy would be unsafe. For instance, the Department of Motor Vehicles or Registry of Motor Vehicles is a public entity. They have a policy that you have to pass a vision test to get your driver's permit. This policy excludes people who are blind from driving. However, this is not in violation of the ADA because it is safety related. A procedure or practice is also a violation of the ADA if it is explicitly discriminatory or if it has a discriminatory effect. This covers the way an entity or program is run and the actions of the people who work there, whether or not this way of being run is written down as part of the official rules. An example of discriminatory behavior would be if someone walked into the Department of Motor Vehicles with a service dog and the employee at the front desk assumed that the person was blind and wouldn't give them the vision test they need to get their driver's permit, or wouldn't give them the paperwork to fill out or something like that. There are a ton of reasons why a service dog might be helping someone, not just blindness. So if the employee refused to give the necessary paperwork or to give the vision test, that would be discrimination. If the person were given the vision test and did not pass, then it would be okay to not issue them a driver's permit. Another example, in line with the example I talked about just before, about entities having to require forms of identification other than driver's licenses. A discriminatory behavior in that case would be if an employee saw someone come in and they offered their state issued ID instead of a driver's license, and that employee said, "Oh, we can't accept that, we need a driver's license." That would be discriminatory behavior, whether or not the policy said they would accept that other form of ID. Discriminatory behavior is a problem even if the policies of the entity are not discriminatory. Discriminatory behavior is still a problem even if the person who's being discriminatory does not know that their behavior is problematic. It's always a problem when a public entity discriminates. If you experience discrimination or inability to access the programs or services of a public entity, there are a few actions you can take. Most public entities have their own grievance processes. You can sometimes learn about these processes by checking the website or calling, or even right when the problematic incident occurs by asking to speak with whoever manages the program. You can also file a complaint directly with the Department of Justice. These complaints are supposed to be filed within 180 days of the incident happening. Finally, if Title II is violated, you can sue the entity without first filing with the Department of Justice. However, in order to get money in compensation in a lawsuit over an ADA violation um, of Title II, you have to be able to prove that the discrimination was intentional, which is really difficult to do. This is not true of filing with the Department of Justice, who can decide that even unintentional discrimination should be dealt with, for instance, by telling the entity to train their employees better about what discrimination is and how to avoid it. I'll post some more awesome resources about the ADA in the comments. Please feel free to comment here or message me at West Region Self-Advocacy on Facebook if you have any questions. And come back next week to hear about Title III of the ADA. Happy birthday to the ADA!